The rain had been falling since lunchtime. Fine and steady. The sort that turns the pavements dark and makes the whole town feel quieter than it really is. I was sitting in a small interview room at my bank, watching thin trails of water slide down the window. Across the table, a woman from the fraud department placed several sheets of paper in front of me. She didn't push them towards me straight away. She seemed to be choosing her words. "Mr. Bennett," she said gently, "I need you to look at these transfers." I already knew what they were. I recognized the dates, the reference numbers, the names of the accounts Rose had told me belonged to solicitors, property agents, and people helping her through a dreadful legal dispute. Still, seeing them printed together was different. On my phone, each transfer had appeared alone. One decision, one emergency, one promise that everything would soon be sorted. On the table, they formed a history I could no longer explain away. The woman turned the final page around. At the bottom was a total, £46. Babe. For a moment, I thought I had read it incorrectly. I leaned closer. The figure remained the same. Nearly everything I had saved since retirement. Money I had protected through rising bills. A leaking roof in years when the boilers seemed determined to bankrupt me. Money Margaret and I had once spoken about leaving to Helen and the grandchildren. The investigator folded her hands. "Mr. Bennett, I need to ask you something difficult." I kept staring at the total. "Have you ever met this woman in person?" My mouth opened, but no answer came. Instead, I looked down at my hands. They appeared older than I remembered. The knuckles swollen slightly with arthritis. A dark mark beneath one thumbnail from working in the garden the previous afternoon. Those same hands had held my phone while I sent Rose photographs of the first daffodils. She had replied within minutes. "Margaret chose those beautifully. You can always tell when someone planted with love." That was the sort of thing she said. Not grand declarations. Small things. Things that made me believe she understood. She knew the name of every plant Margaret put there. I said at last. The investigator said nothing. She remembered the date my wife died. My voice sounded unfamiliar in the quiet room. She spoke to me every morning. Every night. The woman glanced towards my phone. "Has she contacted you today?" I picked it up again. Although I had checked it dozens of times since breakfast. No new messages. No missed calls. Only the last thing Rose had written. "I'll call as soon as I'm safe. Please trust me." I showed it to the investigator as though it proved something. She said she was in danger. When was this sent? 3 days ago. And since then, I shook my head. That morning, her number had stopped working. By lunchtime, her profile in the gardening group had disappeared. The photographs were gone. 11 months of messages remained on my phone. But the woman behind them had vanished as though she had never existed. I thought of the greenhouse at home. For 6 years, I had barely touched it. Margaret's old pots still sat beneath the bench. Her labels were still pushed into trays of dry soil. Then Rose had said we might use it together one day. So I had begun clearing one side. I scrubbed the glass, moved the broken tools, made space for someone I believed was coming into my life. Now there was an empty corner waiting for a woman whose name might not even have been real. The investigator spoke carefully. "We have serious concerns that the identity you were given was false." I felt something inside me tighten. "No. Mr. Bennett. No. You don't understand." I had trusted Rose more than anyone since Margaret died. I had told her things I had not told my own daughter. How frightened I was of becoming a burden. How long Sunday afternoons felt. How sometimes I kept the radio on simply to hear another human voice. She knew all of it. And now the money was gone. Her number was disconnected. Her profile had vanished. I sat there listening to the rain against the glass, trying to understand how 11 months of my life could disappear in a single morning. Then one question rose above all the others. If Rose Fletcher had never existed, who had I been speaking to every night? 6 years before I sat in that bank interview room. Margaret died after a short illness. We had been married for 42 years. People often say that after so long together, you become two halves of the same person. I never used to believe that. Margaret and I were very different in plenty of ways. She liked the radio on from breakfast until bedtime. I preferred quiet. She planted things wherever there was space. I liked rows, labels, and sensible distances between seedlings. But after she was gone, I understood what people meant. The house still worked. The heating came on. The post arrived. The kettle boiled. But nothing seemed to have a proper purpose. The first thing I noticed was the mug. For more than 4 decades, I had placed 2 beside the kettle every morning without thinking. Te for me. Tea for Margaret. After she died, I kept taking 2 mugs from the cupboard. Sometimes I even put a tea bag in both before remembering. The second mug would sit there empty until I quietly returned it to the shelf. Her half of the wardrobe remained exactly as she had left it. Coats, cardigans, a blue dress she had worn to Helen's wedding anniversary dinner. For months, I couldn't bring myself to move any of it. Even opening the wardrobe released the faint scent of her lavender sachets. And for a second, the room felt occupied again. I began leaving the radio on all day. Although I rarely listened, the voices followed me from the kitchen to the sitting room, filling spaces I had not realized could become so large. Shopping became another reminder. Most food seemed designed for 2 people. 2 salmon fillets, 2 puddings, family-sized pies. I would stand in Tesco holding packets and wondering what I was meant to do with the other half. Sunday afternoons were the worst. They seemed longer than an entire week at work. When I was employed on the railway, there had always been something requiring attention. A fault to investigate. A shift to prepare for. A colleague ringing with a question. Retirement had already made life quieter. Bereavement made it silent. Still, I managed. I paid the bills on time. I attended my GP appointments. I cleaned the house every Friday morning and put the bins out every Thursday night. If anyone asked, I said, I'm getting on, all right? And in practical terms, I was. It was the rest of life that slowly began to shrink. A few retired railway colleagues and I used to meet at a cafe near Shrewsbury Station. At first, we went every fortnight. Then one of the men moved to Scotland to be nearer his daughter. Another developed heart trouble. Someone would cancel. Then someone else. And eventually, the meetings stopped without any of us officially ending them. Helen rang every Sunday. She had a busy life in Bristol, with Mark and the children. Our calls often included doors closing, someone asking where their school shoes were, or a timer going off in the kitchen. She invited me down regularly. You could stay for a week. Dad, I don't want to be under your feet. You wouldn't be. I know. Perhaps next month. I always found a reason not to go. The truth was, I didn't want Helen rearranging her life around me. I had spent years making sure she could manage without us. I couldn't bear the idea of becoming another responsibility. So most of my days revolved around the garden. Margaret had created nearly all of it. Lavender ran beside the path. Climbing roses covered the back fence. Sweet peas appeared every summer. No matter how often, I forgot where she had planted them. At the bottom stood a small greenhouse and an old wooden bench where we used to drink tea. I kept everything tidy, but I never changed anything. It felt as though removing a plant or replacing a pot would mean losing another small part of her. One afternoon, my neighbor, Mrs. Pritchard, found me staring at one of the rose bushes. Its leaves were spotted and the stems looked weak. You ought to ask one of those gardening groups online, she said. Wouldn't know where to begin. It's not difficult. I thought the internet was mostly arguments and people selling things. She laughed. That as well. That evening, after a bowl of soup and nearly an hour of television I hadn't followed, I opened my laptop. It took me some time, but eventually I joined a gardening group. I uploaded a photograph of the rose bush and typed, "Can anyone tell me whether this can still be saved? It belonged to my late wife." The replies came quickly. Pruning advice, fungicide recommendations, comments about drainage. Then one message made me stop. Don't cut it down yet. Old roses can look finished long before they truly are. The name beside it was Rose Fletcher. I read the sentence 3 times, and I found myself wondering whether she was only talking about the plant, or whether, somehow, she had understood something about me. The following morning, I opened the gardening group before I had even made my tea. Rose Fletcher had replied again. She asked whether the rose received morning or afternoon sun, whether the soil stayed wet after rain, and when I had last pruned it properly. The questions were practical, specific. Nothing about them felt like an excuse to continue talking. I answered as carefully as I could. Within an hour, she sent me a private message with a short list of things to try. Remove the affected leaves. Clear the soil around the base. Improve the airflow. Feed it lightly, but not too much. Old plants don't always need rescuing. She wrote, sometimes they only need patience. I thanked her. That might have been the end of it. Instead, she asked what sort of rose it was. I told her Margaret had called it Times Gertrude Jekyll, though I had never been entirely certain. A lovely choice. Rose replied, traditional English roses have character. They don't always behave, but that's part of the charm. I smiled at that. Margaret had said almost exactly the same thing. For the first few weeks, Rose and I spoke almost entirely about gardening. She wanted to know how many hours of light reached the back fence. I asked whether coffee grounds really helped the soil. She explained why my sweet peas had probably failed the previous summer and advised me not to plant tomatoes too early, no matter how tempting the first warm week might be. She said she had worked as a teaching assistant at a primary school near Worcester and had helped care for the school garden. The children were better at planting than waiting. She wrote, I know the feeling. I replied, gradually. We began exchanging photographs. Nothing remarkable. Seed trays on windowsills, tulips flattened by rain, a blackbird stealing from a feeder, a catalog beside a mug of tea. Ons? Rose sent a picture of plastic bottles cut in half and placed over young plants. My glamorous slug defense, she called it. I sent her a photograph of an old baking tray balanced beneath my bird table to stop the pigeons taking everything. Railway engineering at its finest. She replied. I laughed aloud. It surprised me. Rose's photographs made her seem ordinary. She wore sensible coats, gardening gloves, and muddy boots. Her silver hair was usually tied back loosely, and she smiled without appearing to pose. She was attractive, but not in a way that made me suspicious. More importantly, she never tried to flatter me. She didn't tell me I looked younger than 71. She didn't call me handsome. She didn't ask about my house, pension, or savings. She asked whether the rose had produced any new growth. That felt safe. Over time, our conversations began moving beyond plants. Rose told me that gardening had helped her through a difficult divorce. She said there had been mornings when getting dressed felt impossible, but watering seedlings gave her a reason to go outside. I understood that. When she asked about Margaret, she did so gently. Never too many questions at once. Never with the sort of sympathy that makes you feel like a patient. I told her about Margaret buying far too many bulbs every autumn. She'd come home with bags of them, I said, then deny she'd bought more than we needed. Rose replied, there is no such thing as too many bulbs. I told her about our hopeless attempt to grow courgettes. We planted 6 and ended up with enough to feed half of Shropshire. Then there was the holiday in Cornwall when it rained for 5 days. Margaret had packed 3 summer dresses and 1 thin cardigan. We spent most of the week in cafes. I said, sounds perfect to me. Rose answered. I even told her about the afternoon. Margaret painted the garden shed the wrong shade of green. She had ordered sage. What arrived was closer to mint toothpaste. I pretended I liked it for nearly 10 years. I admitted. Rose sent a laughing voice message. It was the first time I heard her voice. Warm. Mathieu. A little hesitant. A few days later, she suggested a proper call. I nearly refused. Messaging felt harmless. A voice call felt more personal, more intimate. For half an hour, I stared at the screen before finally pressing accept. Hello. Arthur. Hearing her say my name unsettled me at first. Then she laughed when I apologized for rambling about compost. You're not rambling, she said. It's nice listening to someone who cares about things. We spoke for almost 2 hours. Gardens, old jobs, bad television. The strange way evenings seemed longer after living alone. When it was time to end the call, neither of us seemed willing to be the first to say goodbye. At last, Rose said quietly, I've not felt this comfortable talking to someone for a very long time. That night, I lay awake with an unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't love. Not then. It was simply the knowledge that something pleasant might happen tomorrow. Before 7 the next morning, her message arrived. I thought of you when I saw the frost on the roses. I read it twice beneath the glow of my bedside lamp. Was I beginning an ordinary friendship, or quietly stepping into something neither of us was ready to name? Over the next 4 months, Rose became woven into the shape of my days. Her first message usually arrived before I had finished making breakfast. Morning. Arthur, did you sleep any better? I would answer while the kettle boiled. If I had a dental appointment. She remembered. If Helen and Mark were celebrating their wedding anniversary. Rose asked how they had enjoyed it. She knew I disliked instant coffee. That Mrs. Pritchard's cat was called Jasper. And that the pale pink rose by the shed always flowered before the others. Those details mattered. Anyone can ask how you are. Remembering the answer is different. Most evenings, we spoke by phone or video. I began preparing for the calls without admitting it to myself. I changed out of my gardening clothes, tidied the sitting room, moved newspapers from the chair behind me. Once, Rose laughed and said the old standard lamp made me look exhausted. The following week, I bought a new one from a shop in town. It was ridiculous. Really? At 71. I was arranging the lighting before speaking to a woman. As though I were a nervous young man again. Rose told me more about her own life as well. She said her former husband had controlled every household expense, even after their divorce. She still felt anxious discussing money. Her son, Daniel, had moved to Australia and rarely rang. He sends photographs, she said one evening. Beaches, barbecues, the children growing taller. Sometimes I feel I'm watching his life through a window. I understood more than I wanted to. She also spoke about the cottage she rented near Worcester. The landlord might sell it. She said. She worried about having to move. I don't need a grand life, she told me. I only want somewhere that feels safe. Somewhere I'm known. There was no performance in her voice, only weariness, or what I believed was weariness. The thing Rose handled most carefully was Margaret. She never competed with her memory, never changed the subject when I mentioned her. One evening, I apologized for talking about my wife so often. Rose answered at once. You don't stop loving someone because they're gone. The heart simply learns to make room differently. I sat in silence after she said it. For years, part of me had believed that wanting companionship meant betraying Margaret. Rose made it sound possible to remember one person while caring for another. That was when I began going into the greenhouse again. At first, I only opened the door. The air inside smelt of damp wood, old compost, and the faint dryness of unused terracotta pots. Margaret's tools still hung from hooks along the wall. Her handwriting remained on faded plant labels. Rose encouraged me not to clear everything at once. Leave what matters, she said. Make room without erasing anything. Together, we chose tomato varieties and sweet peas from a catalog. I cleared a bench on the right-hand side. That can be your corner, I joked. Rose's corner, provided you don't fill it with too many bulbs. No promises. A small parcel arrived several days later. Inside was a pair of gardening gloves and a packet of sweet pea seeds. Nothing expensive. There was a note tucked beneath them. For new beginnings. I kept it in the drawer beside my bed. Eventually, I told Helen. She was quiet for a moment. Then said, You sound happy. Dad. I think I am. Have you met her? Not yet. Rose and I had discussed meeting several times. The first plan was canceled because of a migraine, the next because her train was delayed, and then canceled altogether. Another time, she said, an elderly neighbor had fallen and needed help. Then there was an urgent problem with her rented cottage. Each reason made sense on its own. Helen sounded cautious, but not unkind. Just take things slowly. That's exactly what we're doing. And I believed it. Rose never made grand promises. We spoke about a weekend in the Cotswolds, a visit to the RHS garden at Bridgewater, perhaps one day, sharing a home. But whenever I became too enthusiastic, she reminded me there was no need to rush. Her restraint reassured me. On Margaret's birthday, I woke before dawn and spent most of the day avoiding the greenhouse. By evening, I was barely speaking. Rose stayed on the phone until after midnight. I told her things I had never said aloud. How guilty I felt whenever I laughed. How frightened I was that the happiest part of my life had already ended. I thought the part of me that needed someone had died with Margaret. I said. Rose was silent for a moment. Perhaps it was only waiting for you to feel safe again. My eyes filled before I could stop them. I love you, I whispered. There was a long pause. Then Rose said, I love you too. The following morning, her message arrived later than usual. She said she was dealing with a rather frightening financial problem. Concern Rose and me immediately. But beneath it was something else. A small unease I did not want to examine. Why had she waited until the day after? I said I loved her to tell me. Rose did not explain the problem immediately. For most of that morning, she replied in short messages. It's complicated. I don't want to burden you. I'll manage somehow. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me worry more. When we finally spoke that evening, her voice sounded strained. She said the difficulty involved a cottage she had inherited jointly with her sister. There was a dispute over the boundary, unpaid maintenance charges, and legal costs that seemed to increase every time a new letter arrived. I listened while she described solicitors, surveys, and paperwork I barely understood. You never mentioned a sister, I said. There was a brief pause. Stepsister, she replied. We're not close. I don't really think of her as family. The answer came quickly enough. I accepted it. At that stage, Rose still did not ask me for money. She only sounded frightened. So I did what I believed a decent man should do. I listened. I told her not to panic. I said most legal problems looked worse before they were properly examined. For several days, things returned almost to normal. Then the small inconsistencies began appearing more often. One evening, Rose refused to switch on her camera. The signal's dreadful, she said. I could hear her clearly. When I pointed that out, she laughed. Sound and picture aren't always the same, Arthur. I knew very little about such things, so I let it go. During another call, I heard a younger man speaking somewhere behind her. Who's that? I asked. The television. It sounded close. I've got one of those dreadful reality programs on. She changed the subject before I could listen again. A few days later, she sent me a photograph of her garden after what she described as a wet morning near Worcester. The paving stones were dry. Bright sunlight fell across the wall. I checked the weather almost without thinking. It had been raining heavily across Worcestershire all day. When I mentioned it, she said, the photograph was from earlier in the week. Did I say it was taken today? I couldn't remember. That became a pattern. Whenever I noticed something, there was an explanation just reasonable enough to make me feel foolish for asking. Helen was less willing to ignore it. I'd like to speak to her, she said, during our Sunday call. I'm sure she'd be happy to. Rose agreed at once. They arranged a video call for Wednesday evening, an hour before it was due to begin. Rose canceled. She said she had been given an urgent hospital appointment. Helen tried searching for her online. There's almost nothing. Dad. She values privacy. No old work profile. No school newsletters. No mention anywhere. Not everybody puts their whole life on the internet. I could hear myself becoming defensive. Rose and I were from a generation that had grown up without documenting every meal and birthday. Her lack of an online history seemed sensible to me. Private. Even respectable. Then my bank rang. I had attempted to add Rose as a new payee, though I had not yet transferred anything. The advisor asked why I was sending money, whether I had met the recipient, and whether anyone had placed me under pressure. I haven't sent a penny, I said. We still need to check. Mr. Bennett. The questions made me feel old. Not protected. Managed. I ended the call sooner than I should have. When I told Rose, she went quiet. I thought you knew me better than strangers behind a desk, she said. The word stung. I do. Then why are we allowing them into something private? She apologized later. She said the legal stress had made her irritable. I told myself anyone might react badly if they felt distrusted. Still, that evening, I opened the photographs she had sent over the previous months. I studied them properly for the first time. In one image, Rose stood beside a vase of white lilies. In another, supposedly taken months later in a different room, the same vase appeared behind her. Not merely similar. The flowers leaned at exactly the same angle. Even one fallen petal rested in the same place. I sent her both photographs. Can you explain this? There was no reply. An hour passed. Then 3. By the 6th hour, I had checked my phone so often that my hands were trembling. When Rose finally called, she was crying. Arthur, something terrible has happened. Her breathing sounded broken. I don't know who else I can trust. Every doubt I had gathered vanished beneath the fear in her voice. But as I listened, another thought formed quietly beneath my concern. Was Rose genuinely terrified? Or had I just been carefully prepared for the question she was about to ask? For a few moments, Rose could barely speak. I stood beside the kitchen window with the phone pressed to my ear, watching rain gather on the greenhouse roof. Slowly, I said, "Tell me what's happened." She took a shaky breath. Her solicitor, she explained, had temporarily frozen access to part of her bank account while the cottage dispute was being resolved. A filing deadline had been brought forward. Unless she paid the legal costs immediately, she could lose her claim altogether. How much, I asked. There was a pause. Please don't ask me that. Rose, I hate this. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. It's £1,200. I said nothing. She rushed to fill the silence. Please say no if this makes you uncomfortable. I would rather lose the cottage than lose your respect. Those words did something to me. She was giving me permission to refuse. At least, that was how it felt. I looked through the glass at Margaret's roses bending in the rain. I can't manage 1,200. I said, I know. Forget I mentioned it. But I could help with 500. No. Arthur, you said there's a deadline. I shouldn't have told you. You didn't ask. I offered. She resisted for another minute before finally accepting. Reluctantly, I thought. Gratefully, I logged into my banking app and transferred the money. It was not a reckless amount. Less than I had once spent repairing the roof. Enough to help someone I loved through a temporary difficulty. Rose sent message after message afterwards. I don't deserve you. I'll repay every penny within 10 days. You've no idea what this means. For the next week, she became more attentive than ever. She rang in the mornings, sent photographs during the day, spoke excitedly about visiting Shrewsbury. Once the legal problem was finished, we'll plant those sweet peas together, she said. I allowed myself to picture it. Rose beside me in the greenhouse, mud on her gloves, tea cooling on Margaret's old bench. 10 days passed. The money did not return. Rose said another complication had arisen. The solicitor could not release the documents until a further fee was paid. This time, the amount was £3,600. I felt the first real weight of doubt. That's a great deal of money. I know. I thought the 500 settled it. So did I. She did not become angry. She simply went quiet. After a while, she said, I'll understand if you don't believe me. That isn't what I said. My former husband always accused me of lying whenever I needed anything. Her voice hardened slightly. I promised myself I would never beg another man. Guilt came almost at once. I pictured her alone in a rented cottage, frightened of losing the only security she had. I sent the money. The next 6 weeks became a series of emergencies. £2,400 for urgent repairs. $5,000 for tax connected to the inherited property. $8,500 to prevent repossession. Then £12,000 for what Rose called a temporary legal bond. Every time. She assured me it was the final obstacle. Every time. She sent documents that looked official. Letterheads. Reference numbers. Names of solicitors. Email addresses that appeared entirely genuine. I began moving money from the savings account Margaret and I had built over decades. I told myself I was not giving it away. I was protecting an asset that might one day belong to both of us. Then Rose asked for another £15,000. I stared at the figure on the screen until the numbers blurred. I need to speak to your solicitor, I said when she rang. That isn't possible. Why not? The agreement is confidential. I've already sent thousands. If you involve anyone else, the whole arrangement may collapse. For the first time, I refused. No. Rose. Not without speaking to someone. She ended the call quietly. Then she disappeared. No message. No calls. Nothing for 24 hours. By the following evening, I had convinced myself something terrible had happened. When she finally returned, her voice was weak. She said she had collapsed from stress and been admitted to hospital. I was frightened you died. I told her, I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry. The apology came from me. I stopped asking questions. I transferred the money. A moment later, my phone buzzed. Rose had sent one final message. There is one more thing I have not told you. I read it twice. My heart beating hard against my ribs. What truth could possibly remain? After I had already risked nearly everything, Rose did not explain what she had been hiding. Not then, when I asked. She said she was too tired after leaving hospital and promised we would speak properly the following morning. That call never came. Instead, Helen arrived at my house just after 11 on Sunday. I had forgotten our usual telephone call completely. She stood on the doorstep in a raincoat, holding a bag of groceries and looking more worried than annoyed. Dad, are you all right? Of course. You didn't answer yesterday. I must have left the phone upstairs. It was a poor lie. We both knew it. She came inside before I could object. The house was not dirty, but it was no longer as orderly as I usually kept it. Several envelopes lay unopened on the sideboard. A stack of washing sat at the bottom of the stairs. The milk in the fridge was nearly finished, and there was little else beyond half a loaf and a jar of mustard. Helen opened the greenhouse door and looked inside. The tomato plants had begun to droop. The sweet pea trays were dry. You haven't been looking after these. I've had other things on my mind. Back in the kitchen, she noticed a red-edged envelope beneath the newspaper. A final reminder for the electricity bill. You never miss payments. I overlooked one. Then my phone vibrated on the table. Rose's name appeared on the screen. Another message followed before the first notification had disappeared. Helen looked at me. Is this about her? I picked up the phone quickly. It's private. Have you sent Rose money? The room seemed suddenly smaller. No. The answer came too quickly. Helen's face changed. Not anger. Something worse. Disappointment. Dad. I turned towards the kettle. Though neither of us wanted tea. It was only a small amount. How much? £500. That was the first payment. It was not the truth she had asked for. Helen pulled out a chair. Please sit down. I'm perfectly capable of standing. I'm not saying you aren't. She spoke softly, which made me feel even more ashamed. Can I see your bank statement? No. Why not? Because I'm 71 years old. Helen. And I don't need my daughter inspecting my finances. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. This is exactly how these people work. They don't begin with money. They begin by learning what you miss. The words struck too close to something I had been refusing to see. I became angry because anger was easier. You speak to me once a week. Helen. Rose speaks to me every day. The moment I said it, I wanted to take it back. Helen stared at me. I have a family. Dad. A job. Children. That doesn't mean I don't love you. I didn't say that. You did. She left the kitchen and stood in the hallway for several minutes. I heard her crying quietly. I remained beside the sink, too proud to follow her. When she returned, Mark was with her. He had driven from Bristol after Helen rang him from the car. He did not accuse me of anything. He sat at the table and asked calm, practical questions. Have you met Rose? No. Have you spoken directly to her solicitor? She says, the agreement is confidential. Have you checked the cottage through the land registry? No. Each answer sounded less convincing than the last. Helen asked to see one photograph. I refused at first. Then, perhaps because some part of me wanted her to prove my fears wrong, I handed over the phone. She saved the image and performed what she called a reverse image search. Within seconds, the same woman appeared on a professional website, a garden designer based in Surrey. Her name was Caroline Marsh. There were photographs of her beside her husband, at exhibitions, in gardens Rose had claimed were her own. That doesn't mean anything, I said. Helen looked at me sadly. It means the photographs are stolen. Perhaps Rose was ashamed of how she looks. Even as I spoke, I heard how desperate it sounded. Perhaps she used someone else's face. But the rest was true. Helen found Caroline's business email and wrote to her. The reply arrived within an hour. Caroline said several of her photographs had been used in fake profiles before. She had never heard of Rose Fletcher. She had never spoken to me. My stomach turned so sharply that I had to grip the edge of the table. Still, one final possibility remained. The voice, the memories, the affection. Those could not all be false. Call her, Helen said. I pressed Rose's number. She answered on the fourth ring. Arthur. Before I could speak, Helen leaned towards the phone. We know the photographs aren't yours. There was complete silence. Then the line went dead. A minute later, a message appeared. Your daughter has put my life in danger. Do not contact the police. I read it aloud. Helen reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Was this finally proof that Rose had deceived me? Or had our attempt to uncover the truth placed a real woman in danger? Helen did not argue with me after that message arrived. She simply sat at the kitchen table while I read it again. Your daughter has put my life in danger. Do not contact the police. The words frightened me because they gave me one final reason to believe Rose. If she was being watched, perhaps the false photographs had been a way of protecting herself. Perhaps the solicitor had been involved in something she had not understood. Perhaps Helen had pushed too hard. I wanted any explanation that allowed Rose to remain real. Helen waited until I put the phone down. Dad, we need to ring the bank. I'm not contacting the police. I said the bank. She told me not to involve anyone. That is exactly why we have to. Her voice remained calm, but there was no uncertainty in it. For once, I was too tired to resist. The fraud department asked us to come in the following morning. The same woman who later showed me the total of £46,800 began by examining each transfer separately. The payments had not gone to one solicitor or one property company. They had gone through several different accounts. Some were personal accounts. Others had been opened using stolen identities. The woman typed the name of Rose's supposed solicitor into her computer. No legitimate firm existed at that address. The professional registration number belonged to someone else. Then she checked the cottage. The property was real. That discovery gave me a brief, foolish burst of relief. But the cottage had belonged to the same elderly couple for more than 30 years. There was no inheritance dispute, no boundary case, no stepsister, no legal bond, nothing. I handed over my phone. 11 months of messages, emails, photographs, voice recordings, every private thing I had once guarded because it felt precious. Investigators later explained that the person I knew as Rose might not have been one person at all. One member of the group could have handled the gardening conversations. Another might have made the voice calls. Someone else created the legal letters and controlled the bank accounts. I struggled to understand that. Who remembered Margaret's birthday, I asked. The investigator looked at me kindly. Mr. Bennett. These groups record everything you tell them. She showed me how details had been gathered over time. My pension income, the amount I had in savings, Helen's concern, the fact I hated becoming a burden, the layout of my home, the greenhouse. Margaret. They had not listened because they cared. They had listened because information made me easier to control. My honesty had become their map. The bank could not promise the money would be returned. I had authorized every transfer myself. Still, they agreed to review whether stronger safeguarding questions should have been asked once the payments became larger and more frequent. The police traced some of the money to a British account holder who had been recruited through what he believed was a work-from-home payment processing scheme. He was arrested. A phone seized from him contained messages connected to several victims. One entry referred to me. Not Arthur. Not Mr. Bennett. The gardener. Beneath it were instructions. Mention Margaret when he hesitates. Avoid meeting. Make daughter seem controlling. Use hospital crisis if payment delayed. Keep him isolated. Prepare final request before account closure. I read the notes twice. Then I asked them to take the page away. For 11 months. I had believed our relationship was something unique. To the people behind it. I was not even a person. I was a type. A method. A reliable response to a particular kind of pressure. One investigator played a recovered voice message. A man was speaking to someone else involved in the fraud. He laughed about how easily the old gardener had accepted the hospital story. The chair scraped backwards as I stood. I reached the corridor before I was sick. Helen followed. But I told her to leave me alone for the rest of that day. I barely spoke to her. That evening, I sat in Margaret's greenhouse with the door closed. The air was cold. The sweet pea trays had dried out completely. Rose's gloves still rested beside the packet of seeds. I thought about Margaret, about the savings we had built together, about the promises I had made to protect Helen and the grandchildren. I felt foolish, ashamed, worse than that. I felt disloyal, as though wanting another woman's companionship had somehow damaged the life Margaret and I had shared. Helen found me after dark. She sat beside me, without switching on the light. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she asked quietly, "How much was it?" "Dad," I could no longer lie. 46,800 pounds. Her breath caught. Some of it was for the children. I waited for anger. It did not come. Helen moved closer. "They stole from you." "Dad." "I gave it to them. They spent months making sure you would. I should have known. They also worked very hard to make you blame yourself." She took my hand. "Don't finish their job for them." Something in me finally gave way. I cried then. Not quietly. Not with dignity. It was the first time Helen had seen me cry since Margaret's funeral. A few days later, I agreed to help the police. But one question remained. And no investigator could answer it for me. If every detail about Rose was false, had any part of what I felt been real at all? The investigation continued for several months. At first, I expected progress to feel like relief. It did not. Every new piece of information seemed to remove another small part of the person I had believed Rose to be. The man arrested in Britain agreed to cooperate. He had allowed money to pass through accounts connected to him, though he claimed he had been recruited through a work-from-home advertisement and had not understood the full operation at first. The police recovered access to messaging groups, payment records, and lists of fake profiles. There were dozens of names. Vidowers, retired teachers, former nurses, people living alone in towns and villages across Britain. Each profile had a different story. A soldier overseas, an engineer trapped abroad, a divorced woman fighting for an inheritance, a gardener near Worcester. Two of the organizers were eventually identified in the UK. Both were charged with fraud. money laundering, and offenses connected to the wider conspiracy. Others appeared to be operating from outside the country. The police were honest with me. They may not all be caught. The officer said. I nodded. By then, I had stopped expecting perfect justice. I was asked to provide a formal victim statement. I rewrote it 3 times. The first version focused almost entirely on the money. £46,800. The figure looked clear and respectable on paper. The rest was harder to explain. How do you describe the loss of someone who never existed? Eventually, I wrote about the mornings when I still woke expecting Rose's message. The fear I felt whenever an unknown number appeared on my phone. The shame of telling Helen I had lead to her. The way I avoided the gardening group because I imagined everyone somehow knew. I wrote about hearing those men laugh. About discovering that the private details of Margaret's life had been turned into instructions. Most of all, I wrote about trust. I no longer know whether kindness is genuine, I said in my statement, or whether someone is simply waiting to learn how I can be used. The financial investigation continued separately. A review by the Ombudsman found that my bank should have intervened more firmly once the payments began increasing so quickly. They had asked questions, but not enough. Several transfers had followed the same pattern. New recipients, urgent explanations, amounts far larger than anything I usually sent. The bank agreed to return a substantial portion of what I had lost, just over £31,000. When the money appeared in my account, I sat staring at the balance. I felt grateful, but not victorious. Some of the savings were still gone. More importantly, the refund did not restore the person I had thought I knew. The court ordered compensation from funds that had been seized, though I was warned I might never receive the full amount. One defendant was given a prison sentence. The other received a shorter one after cooperating with investigators. Helen asked whether the sentences made me feel better. I don't know. I admitted. That was the truth. Punishment could not return 11 months of my life. Some mornings, I still reached for my phone before remembering. There would be no message. Some afternoons, I stood outside the greenhouse and felt embarrassed by the empty space I had once called Rose's Corner. When old railway friends asked why I no longer posted in the gardening group, I made excuses. Then a local community center organized an event about romance fraud. Helen suggested I attend. I'll sit at the back. I told her, you don't have to speak. That was the only reason I agreed. The room was smaller than I expected. Plastic chairs, a table with tea, biscuits and leaflets. Most of the people there were around my age. One woman stood near the front and described a man she had met online. He claimed to be an engineer working overseas. He called her every evening. He told her she was the only person he trusted. Then he asked for money. As she spoke, her voice became quieter. I should have known better, she said. I was so stupid. I recognized the shame before she finished the sentence. I stood up. My knees felt unsteady. They did not deceive us because we were stupid, I said. Everyone turned towards me. They deceived us because we were human, and because they studied what being alone had done to us. The room became completely silent. Afterwards, the woman found me beside the tea table. Do you think people like us can ever trust anyone again? I wanted to comfort her. I wanted to give her a simple answer. But as I looked at her, I realized I still did not know. A year has passed since the morning I sat in that bank interview room and watched £46,800 become a single terrible number on a sheet of paper. My life is not exactly as it was before Rose. I don't think it ever will be. But it is no longer standing still. Helen and her family visit more often now. Not out of pity. At least, I don't believe so. We simply stopped pretending that distance and busy lives were reasons not to make an effort. I traveled to Bristol as well. The first time, I nearly canceled because the train seemed crowded and the journey felt unnecessarily long. Then, I remembered how often I had told Helen I didn't want to be a burden. Sometimes independence can become another name for hiding. So I went. I stayed 3 nights. Helped Mark repair a loose fence panel. Took the grandchildren out for lunch. On the final evening, we sat together watching a program. none of us particularly enjoyed. And I realized ordinary company was what I had been missing all along. Back in Shrewsbury, I joined a local gardening club, Ariel 1. We meet twice a month in a church hall that always smells faintly of furniture, polish, and damp coats. Nobody asks for bank transfers. Nobody disappears when you suggest meeting. We argue about compost, exchange cuttings, and drink tea from cups that never quite look clean. It is imperfect. That is partly why I trust it. The club began helping restore the neglected garden behind a nearby community center. At first, I only offered advice. Then someone handed me a spade. Before long, I was turning soil beside people whose surnames I still didn't know. There was comfort in working without having to explain myself. The greatest change, though, happened at home. For 6 years after Margaret died, I had treated the greenhouse like a room preserved behind glass. Then I cleared one side for Rose. After the fraud, I wanted to shut the door and never enter it again. Instead, one Saturday morning, my granddaughter came outside carrying a notebook. Mom says, "You know how to grow sweet peas. Your grandmother did. So you don't. I know enough to make mistakes confidently." She laughed. Together, we cleared the unused bench. I left Margaret's tools on their hooks. Her faded labels remained in the old trays. Keeping them no longer felt like refusing to move forward. They were simply part of the place. I built a small potting table for my granddaughter. It leaned slightly to one side, but she declared it perfect. Then we planted the sweet peas I had once imagined growing with Rose. For weeks, I watched the shoots climb. When the first flowers opened, I felt sadness, but it was no longer the sort that emptied a room. The criminals had taken my money. They had studied my memories and used Margaret's name to make me obey. But they had not created my ability to love. That belonged to me long before Rose appeared. It still belonged to me now. I kept the original packet of seeds she sent. For a while, I considered throwing it away. Instead, I placed it in a drawer, not as proof that I had been foolish, as proof that some part of me had wanted to begin living again. One warm afternoon, I sat on Margaret's old wooden bench while my granddaughter worked in the greenhouse. Helen came through the back door carrying 3 mugs of tea. "Don't let hers go cold," she said. "She'll forget it's there. Runs in the family." Helen smiled and sat beside me. Across the garden, the rose bush that had started everything had flowered again. A year earlier, I might have taken a photograph and sent it to Rose. That day, I simply looked at it. Then I listened to my granddaughter moving pots inside the greenhouse and Helen quietly drinking her tea beside me. I still believe trust is dangerous when it asks you to ignore the people who know you best. But I no longer believe fear should decide the rest of my life. So I leave you with the question I have asked myself ever since. When someone has used your loneliness against you, is courage refusing to trust again? Or is it learning to trust without surrendering yourself?